Okay. And before we get to the other two branches of government, the executive branch and the judicial branch, I wanted to just kind of fill in a few things that I didn't really touch on when it comes to the legislative branch. So, just a few things to finish up our talk on the legislative branch. For one, who's eligible to serve in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. We've seen some of this information in the past, but just as a refresher, to be eligible to serve in the House of Representatives, you want to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years. So, if you're new to the country and you've been here that long, then you can be a representative. And there are some immigrants who have served in Congress. You must reside in the state where you are elected, and there are cases more so with Senate seats. I'm not familiar with representatives moving to a new location just to run for. They might move to a different county or something like that, but you must reside, so you have to be from that congressional district that you are serving. So Steve Stivers, like I talked about, he lives somewhere, probably here in Franklin County somewhere, but you have to live in that district. The term is for 2 years, which we talked about. So you're up for election every 2 years. There's a pretty quick turnaround with the House of Representatives. And as we mentioned also, there's no term limit. So you can keep running and keep serving for as long as you want. So eligibility for the U.S. Senate. Got to be a little bit older. Got to be 30 years old. Must be a U.S. for 9 years. Okay. But was there a question? Oh, okay. So you have to be a U.S. citizen for 9 years. And same here, right? You have to, so rather than having a congressional district, right, you serve the entire state. So it's a statewide election, but you have to live in that state. And there have been cases where people have relocated to a state to run for that position. Typically, they have some type of connection with that state. So when Hillary Clinton became a senator, she moved to New York. She set up a residence in New York, where, of course, she had a connection. I think she's originally from New York. But, of course, she had been, wife of Bill Clinton, so she had been the first lady of Arkansas, or whatever they call the governor's wife in Arkansas, and of course she was the first lady. But she set up a residence in New York. Mitt Romney, who was the governor of Massachusetts, is now the senator of one of the two senators from Utah. So he had relocated there to run. It is a 6-year term, which I mentioned, and so since we have 2 senators per state, they stagger those every 3 years. They're offset by 3 years, so you're not reelecting 2 senators at the same time. You have one that's gonna still be serving, and like right now we're in Ohio this year, the race to replace. Can't even remember his name. He was the Republican senator. I guess he's still the Republican senator, but he decided to not run again. So the race is between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance for that seat. Sherrod Brown is our other U.S. senator for Ohio, and he will be up for election in another 3 years. He was elected 3 years ago. And then, of course, just like that's misspelled, that should be term limits, not limites. But there's no term limits there either. So you can run for the rest of your life and keep getting elected. And we've had senators and several representatives who have served for decades, and will keep serving a lot of times until they just kill over. But we want to move on now. So a couple things I sort of wanted to clarify if I didn't give a good explanation, right, of how legislation works and how Congress makes legislation. And it's a whole complicated process, but just a few terms to consider here and how that works. So when new legislation is introduced in Congress, whether it's through the Senate or the House of Representatives, it's called a bill. Okay. And then, of course, that bill goes through debates. It'll get modified. It will get tossed back and forth between the House and the Senate. And perfected basically. They're usually introduced by a committee, and it'll have somebody's name attached to it that's sort of like the main author of that bill, a representative or a senator. If both the House and Senate vote on this bill, they vote to approve this bill, it becomes an act. Now, a lot of times we still refer to what has become laws as acts. So you think about the Obamacare, right? Its official name is the Affordable Health Care Act. It is a law. The Americans with Disability Act is a law. But it kind of keeps that name a lot of times. Once it is passed through Congress and it's approved by Congress, it then goes to the president, who will sign it into law or veto that. So if he rejects it, he vetoes it. Then it can go back to Congress, and so they have a chance to override the presidential veto with a majority 2/3 vote by both chambers. Okay, so and that's pretty difficult a lot of times because of bipartisanship and things like that. But they can override it. They have an opportunity to override it. So either way, whether he signs it or vetoes it and it goes back to Congress and they actually manage to get a 2/3 vote on it. Sometimes it just goes back and it gets changed, and he may approve it later, or they might approve it later. So then it becomes law. An amendment is a little bit different because it's a very formal, a very big change to the U.S. Constitution, and that's with the capital A. They make amendments to bills with the lowercase a, right? That's just meaning changing wording or adding or taking things away from a bill. But capital A amendment is a major change to the U.S. Constitution. It typically starts just like a bill in Congress, or it could be proposed by a constitutional convention. And there's only one constitutional convention, and that is when we agreed upon the U.S. Constitution as the law of the land. There's only been one major constitutional convention. But the states could call a constitutional convention if they wanted to make a change. And I don't know as far as exactly how that works, or what type of vote they would need to actually bring a proposal to Congress, right? But then Congress would have to have a 2/3 majority of vote again in Congress. So obviously this bypasses the president. If it is an amendment and it receives 2/3 majority in Congress, then it gets ratified by the states, which takes 3/4 of the states to agree on. So if you get 75% of the states to say, yes, we want to make this an amendment, then it will become law. So that's why it's such a arduous process and is really deeper than making just a regular law. And of course, it's much easier to overturn just a law or an act than it is to ratify the Constitution. So that's sort of the end of the legislative side. So let's talk about the president and the executive branch. So the executive branch is basically led by one individual. That's the primary person behind the executive branch. However, we'll talk about some of the important offices and things that are under that. Major responsibilities of the president. And again, it is a limited role, even in the 21st century. over the course of our history of the United States, the president has sort of consolidated some power and expanded their influence and their power. But as far as primary responsibility, so just like we talked about with legislation, he signs or vetoes bills, or they sign or veto bills. That's his part in legislation. Setting an agenda. So the president will set an agenda. So that's basically the things that he or she wants to have accomplished during their term. And that's usually modified every year. That's why they will have a State of the Union. And that's when the president sort of announces their, agenda for the year, what they want to work on for the year. And that's, oftentimes what they campaign on. So when they run for election, those main points are part of the agenda that wants to be accomplished. Thinking about one of the issues here recently, Joe Biden has worked on, and there's been legislation that has that's in Congress right now, is a act to help veterans who have suffered respiratory issues or cancer as potentially from burn piles. So when they served in foreign countries and stuff, there's these burn piles and a let off toxic fumes. And that's something that during his State of the Union back, I think, was it him in January? That he had announced as part of his platform for that year. And of course, there's all kinds of other things, and that gets modified, in types of emergencies and things. So the president may also convene and adjourn special sessions of Congress. So if Congress is on vacation or it's after a session and there's a crisis or something, the president can call Congress back to DC, back to the Capitol to work on an issue. They also direct federal agencies. So a lot of times that's in the form of an executive order, which we've talked about. So can direct, the Department of Transportation to, allocate more funds to train service, or I just, it's an example, but and that a lot of times will the extent and breadth of those executive orders are often challenged by the Supreme Court, which we'll talk about, or it was seen as unconstitutional. But there is a lot of leeway with those. Now, with an executive order, it's not a law. So what tends to happen, we get a new president, that president, day one or day two, starts signing executive orders to cancel out the executive orders from the last president. And that's just, if it's one party against the other party, that always happens. But particularly, things like EPA regulations, stuff like that, you'll see executive orders by the president. The president also appoints offices. So first off, the president's cabinet, which are the senior level sort of executive agencies and the officers that are in charge of those. So there's a list of them. We're gonna look at it when we talk about the order of succession, because they're all, as cabinet members, part of the order of succession. But some of the larger and more major ones, the State Department. So you have the Secretary of State, the Defense Department. You have the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, and of course they have an entire federal organization under them. The whole State Department or the Treasury Department. And we talked about, once they are appointed, their nomination goes to Congress and there's hearings, and then there's a confirmation hearing in the Senate to actually vote and appoint that individual to that position. And the same thing with the Supreme Court. They nominate Supreme Court justices. There's other federal offices that they appoint as well, ambassadors and things like that also. They're also sort of the chief ambassador. Foreign relations is a big part of the president's role, negotiating with other countries, signing treaties, just meeting with other heads of state to, talk about different, whether it's crises or coming to some agreements on whether it's related to defense or economics or things like that. And also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And something I really never mentioned as part of our history or anything else, but we have a civilian-controlled military. And that top civilian is the president. So they are allowed to activate the military or send them into situations for a certain time, like up to 60 days in the event of some type of crisis. After that, it's going to require a act. It's going to require Congress to continue approval. The president can declare war, although that also requires some confirmation by Congress as well. And I mean, Joe Biden could declare war on Canada. That doesn't mean we're going to go to war with Canada, right? It means that that's going to have to go to Congress. There's going to have to be funds appropriated for that and things like that. So, just if we have a lunatic that all of a sudden wanted to go start a war with Canada, that doesn't mean we're going to go to war with Canada. There's certainly limitations to how he can serve as commander-in-chief. But that's been a point of contention for a lot of our history. We mentioned the Vietnam War, where Congress gave LBJ a lot of leeway in conducting that war and the resources to fight that war. And that was reeled back after the Vietnam War. And also kind of depends on the president, how involved they are. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was very, very involved with the strategic planning of the Civil War. Others may leave that to the Defense Department and to do most of the planning, but they'll have final say on strategies and things like that. Also, just the head of state, so which is sort of a ceremonial role. It's also sort of tied into the idea of the foreign policy, foreign relations role. As far as meeting with other delegates and stuff like that, but it's also just as a sort of a icon of the nation. So they throw out the first pitch at the opening day of Major League Baseball, or they show up at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics and stuff like that. So somewhat of a ceremonial role involved there as well. So eligibility for the president. So it's a little bit different again, a little more involved than what you have for House of Representatives or the Senate. For starters, 35 years old. Why? That was said a long time ago, and I'm sure that was seen as by the time you get to that age, you're wise enough to lead the country. Must be a resident. Must have been a resident of the United States for at least 14 years, and has to be a natural born citizen. So that's something along the way that they figured you can ensure that the president will have the best interest of the country or whatever. Who knows? That may change at some point. Only 2 terms you're allowed to serve, and that's a little oversimplified, right? We've talked about this a couple times. If you were a vice president or another person in the order of succession, and you served less than 2 years of that previous president's term, you can run for another 2 terms. If you have served more than those 2 years, such as the case of Harry Truman, who served almost the entirety of FDR's final term, then you're allowed to run one more time. But typically, of course, those events are sort of few and far between. So it's usually just a case of someone serving for 2 terms. And we talked about that. That was a result of FDR's presidency. And I think that's the 22nd Amendment or 25th, maybe, where that was ratified. So, order of succession. I want to touch on this for just a minute here. So if something happens to the president and he is no longer capable of serving, then there is a order of succession of who will serve in their place. Of course, that starts with the vice president. And has happened on several occasions due to assassinations. Most recently, that would have been LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, that took over for JFK. The next, which we mentioned, Speaker of the House. So the leader of the House of Representatives. And then the President pro temp, who serves in the absence of the vice president, we talked about in the Senate. And then Secretary of State, that's Anthony Blinken. Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, I believe. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Attorney General, Merrick Garland. I'm probably I don't remember the rest of them, Secretary, but you see the line here. And that's kind of based on, a couple things. So obviously the vice president is elected or is the running mate of the president with that somewhat in mind, right? The vice president has their own duties, but it's, the idea there is that they may be president someday. So they're, somewhat put in that position and is somewhat, in a sense, elected to that position. Speaker of the House comes in that position because it also is an elected role. So they actually switch this around at some point and move the Speaker of the House up because they felt that was an elected role. The people had put them in that position, so they should be higher up. Same thing with the President pro temp of the Senate. And then, of course, we get to all the cabinet secretaries, all the way down the line there, which is somewhat considered in order of importance. The Secretary of State, who is probably the chief ambassador under the president, sort of an important role. So, of course, you'd see Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, really important and some of the older cabinet positions. So, more so than, say, the Secretary of, Veterans Affairs. Not a large office, is why it's down towards the end. The Secretary of Homeland Security is the newest office at the federal level, I believe. So that is also sort of down the line. There was actually a television show that a few years ago with Kiefer Sutherland called Designated Survivor. So when there is an event where most of the cabinet will attend and the vice president will attend, so namely something like the State of the Union address, they will have a designated survivor picked out of the cabinet. Like, let's say, and I think in the show, the character was Secretary of Agriculture. So they put them in a safe place away from this event where everybody else is, just in case there is some type of disaster or terrorist attack or something like that, so we can maintain our government. And that was the whole plot of the show. Was there was a terrorist attack on the Capitol during the State of the Union address. So the designated survivor was this sole cabinet member who was not allowed to go to that because he was, the designated survivor. And he was like Secretary of Agriculture or something. But that's basically how that works. And, the likelihood that we would ever get to Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of Transportation, becoming president, that's highly unlikely. But, you want to have a deep list just in case anything were to happen. So that's how that works. So let's talk about how the president gets elected for just a minute here. So the Electoral College, it is not a location. It is not an actual institute of learning or anything like that. This name was picked a long time ago. And the idea behind it is sort of this mediary, a middleman between the popular vote and the actual election of the president. And in reality, it was a sort of supposed to be a council of people that could intervene if we elected a lunatic, basically. That's the idea behind it. More in modern times, a lot of people have used it to say it gives these smaller states, or what they call, the flyover states in the Midwest. So, for example, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, proportional representation when it comes to the election of the president, right? As I mentioned, there's more people, there's twice as many people in Franklin County than there is in the entire state of Wyoming. So does that mean that their votes should count less? We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the sort of the modern understanding of what the Electoral College does. So it is basically a small group of electorates that are picked, typically, are involved in politics. They might be a state delegate or representative, something like that. And the way it basically works is whoever, by popular vote, wins that state receives the majority or receives all of the electoral votes. There are several states, or a couple states at least, Nebraska and Maine, for example, who proportion their electoral votes based on the districts. So you could win one electoral vote from Nebraska or two, whatever it is. The rest of the states, though, basically throw all of their electoral votes behind the president. There have been, most recently, the 2016 election. I don't think there was in the 2020 election. There might have been one or two. What they call faithless electors, who have, decided not to support the vote of the people and change their vote to the other electorate. Those numbers that you see on the screen here, this is for the 2023, or this is after the reportioning, the reapportionment of the districts, which we talked about. So it represents the map as it is today. This would have been different in 2020. So, what do those numbers mean? So I showed you the district maps for House of Representatives, right? And for 2023, Ohio has 15 electorates. West Virginia will have 2. California has 52. So the Electoral College is the sum of the number of members in Congress. So that's the House of Representatives and the Senate. So California, again, just for example, in 20, with the reapportionment, will have 52 members in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. That's how you get to that electoral number of 54. Wyoming, our big block state here under Montana, right? I keep picking on them, with the population less than, in the 500,000 range, has 1 House of Representative member, right? And 2 senators. So their number of electoral votes is 3. Okay, so when it comes to general election time, we all go out to vote. Once the votes are tabulated, we start getting the results in, and whatever presidential candidate gets the majority of electoral votes, which is 270, they will be elected president. Because there's a total of 538 total electoral votes. The difference there, why isn't it 535? Because we have 435 representatives. We have delegates from Washington, D.C. That also serve in that as well. So that's basically it. That's the Electoral College. So again, the debate is on, is it still necessary? There's a lot of issues concerning the Electoral College. Are these states that claim that they're getting proportionate representation, like Wyoming, actually getting overrepresented by having 3 electoral votes? Because there's only 500,000 people, or 500 some thousand people in the state. So that's kind of an issue, particularly when it comes to certain elections. So the election of the race with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Clinton won the popular vote by over 3 million. So it's something that keeps coming up, the challenges to the idea of something that is this Electoral College antiquated. Does it minimize the voice of some while maximizing the vote of others disproportionately? And just the overall fact, some of these states also that have this idea that it's more proportionate. California. Let's just talk about California for a second. California has the 10th highest GDP, gross domestic product, in the world. It has the 10th largest economy in the world for any country, for any state, for anything. So yeah, it has the most electoral, it has the most people too. It has the largest population, which is why it has 52 House of Representative members. But being the 10th largest economy, maybe it should have a larger say in how the country's run. And maybe, just saying here that, does Wyoming need 3 electoral votes, since it doesn't even really have enough people there to have 1 member of the House of Representatives? It has a at-large member, a token member, just because every state should have representation. So it is something that will probably continue to be debated through at least my lifetime and maybe yours. So we'll see what happens there. But it's basically always been a part of the presidential election system. And of course, it's the only one that we use for that. House of Representative members are popularly elected by their congressional district, senatorial, Senate races, by the state, popular vote by state. So moving along here, and this should take us to the end of civics and government, our last branch, the judicial branch. And that is at the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court. It is the highest court in the land. It supersedes any other court when it comes to its rulings. You have to follow the law of the U.S. Supreme Court and some of its main responsibilities. So judicial review. If there's a mandate, a executive order, a law passed, whatever it may be, coming from the legislative branch or the executive branch, the U.S. Supreme Court gets judicial review to ensure that it meets the law, that it is constitutional. There have been executive orders that have been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court throughout the history of the country. And another way it gets cases, the biggest way, I should say, that it gets cases that it rules on is through judgment on appeals. So in order to get a case to the U.S. Supreme Court, there has to be a ruling by the highest state level court, which is the state level Supreme Court. So we'll take Brown versus Board, for example, right? The ruling in 1954 by the Supreme Court that the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson is antiquated. You cannot have this idea of separate but equal, starting the desegregation process. So Brown versus Board started as a court case in Kansas. I think that was in Topeka, Kansas. And it may have went to like a circuit court, a lower court. It finally went to the state Supreme Court, where there was a ruling against Brown, right? The Board of Education won. Brown appeals that, so it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. Plessy versus Ferguson, same thing. I forget which one's which. Plessy was the gentleman that was riding in the train car, the segregated train car, right? So he won that case in was it Alabama, and the state then appealed it and took it to the Supreme Court, where it was overturned. But it has to go to the highest state court before it can be bumped up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Another responsibility, which is pretty rare today anyway, is judgments on cases where it's state versus state. Typically, that's a territorial issue, like the border of whatever, North Carolina. There's a chunk of land that they believe belongs to them, but Virginia's saying it belongs to them. That's the type of case that would also go to the U.S. Supreme Court. There is sort of one senior member, sort of a leadership role between the 9 justices. That's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who is currently John Roberts. And they have a few sort of administrative duties, so they wind up picking cases that the Supreme Court will hear. When they are part of the majority decision on a case, the Chief Justice will also select an author of the majority opinion. So I've also mentioned this as well. So, whatever the court case is, if there's a ruling, 6-3, 5-4, which is probably what it's going to be most of the time, then they sign someone to write a majority opinion that explains their decision. And there's also a dissenting opinion. So someone from that, group will be selected to write a dissenting opinion to explain why they chose to vote on that case the way they did. And on top of that, there's 9 justices. At some point, way back when, I think there was a fewer number, but this is pretty much where it's been capped for at least a century, I believe. And of course, it's a lifetime appointment. So once you become a Supreme Court justice, you will remain a Supreme Court justice unless you retire. We just had a retirement. I can't remember his name, and I can't remember the lady that's replacing, but this was a Biden nomination, and she has been confirmed and will replace the other justice. And of course, there's certainly debate on whether that is appropriate as well, lifetime appointments. And while the Supreme Court is not supposed to be politicized or it's supposed to be basically apolitical, I guess you would say, presidents pick these justices strategically and often do sort of serve, I don't want to say they serve an agenda, but they certainly skew with a particular political leaning, and that is why they are appointed by a particular president. And of course, on top of that, we have issues when it comes to Senate confirmations, and there's reasons why somebody may want to hold up a nomination, or there's additional investigations into a hearing and things like that. So, and that's largely the three branches of the federal government and how they are selected, how they're either selected or elected. Obviously, our chief official in the executive branch is elected. Our members of Congress are elected. The Supreme Court are the only members of the three co-equal branches that the U.S. population do not have a say in. Those are appointed by the president, of course. Okay, so that will take us through civics and government. So a quick overview of how the government works and what role we play in it as far as electing officials. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, we'll start. We'll spend the entire class on looking at some visual data, maps and timelines in particular, to kind of stress some of those rules about maps and features of maps and the different types of maps that you might see on a GED test. So any questions though, before we take a break here? All righty, so sounds like we don't have any questions. We're working in language today for Essential Ed and Language Arts, a lesson on parallelism, which is pretty important. So let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll go ahead and go to 1:15, and then we'll come back and we'll work on language arts. All right, I'll see you guys in 10.